All right, I told you last week that we were in the section of the book that is the richest part of the book, the richest part of this whole study. It's Paul's great conclusion to everything that he has been talking to them about. There were issues that were brought to his attention by Chloe's people. There were questions that they had brought to Paul, perhaps sent by Chloe's people. There were other things that he recognized that probably were issues among them, just simply what he knew about them. But as he said at the outset of this chapter, this is the most important thing. This is what resounds and sticks with us and gives us meaning, gives us purpose in our lives. I'll remind you again of what he said in verse 4. Verse 4, it was verse 2, where he talked about, this faith in which they stood, they held fast to. He said, unless you believed in vain. As we talked about, that word's kind of an interesting term, and it really just means that you're doing something for no purpose, that there's nothing really that's being accomplished by that. So Paul is telling them that their faith in which they stand has to have a reason for it. There's a purpose for it. And that's really what the rest of this chapter, the rest of this section of his epistle is describing. What is that purpose? And that's what, if we can get to it tonight, that's what we're going to conclude with, is ultimately talking about what that purpose is. But last week we talked about the central part of the chapter. The center part of the chapter is Jesus has been resurrected from the dead. And so because he has been resurrected from the dead, that makes him victorious. That makes him victorious over death. It makes him victorious over the earthly things of this world that will all pass away, because he does not pass away. He lives eternally. So that brings us to verse 29. I think Adam was the one who said that we had a teaser last week. I said we were going to talk about it, but we didn't actually talk about it. This is, I think, without any question, the most controversial part of the chapter. And this is where Paul is asking a series of questions, asking them essentially, I think I've got it up here on my thing. Why do we do this? Those who are denying the resurrection, which Paul says is to their shame. We're going to see this in verse 34, that there were some among them who denied the resurrection, and Paul said that's to your shame. But if you deny the resurrection, then why are Christians doing what they do? And we often focus on the very first question, but it really is part of a series of questions. Why are people doing these things? Now, the first question is the one that everybody says. Paul asks this question, otherwise, what will those do who are baptized for the dead? If the dead are not raised at all, then why are they baptized for them? I've written up here 6 different theories. There are actually many more than this. I think I counted 13 or 14 in the sources that I was reading. I'm sure if I had read more sources, I would have found even more theories. Some of them are just variations on different ideas. I've kind of divided. The ones on the left are the ones that are really just not very reasonable. But at least I think they're something that can at least be brought up to, just to mention. First one is the idea of being baptized from the dead really just kind of adds the word almost. Those who are almost dead. And it's related to the idea of what we would call today a deathbed confession or a deathbed conversion. There's nothing in the context that would suggest that Paul was saying almost dead, nor is there anything here of the idea that it's just someone who's at the point of death. In fact, this is a broader question. It's not specifying just one particular group. The second one is, this was kind of an interesting one to me. I think W. Vine is the only one who has this idea. we need to explain just a little bit. When the Bible was written in Greek, at that time, the Greek language did not have punctuation. So when they wrote out these Greek words, they didn't put spaces between the letters. I mean, it was really kind of a situation where the translators were trying to understand, based on their knowledge of the language, where to put the punctuation. And for the most part, translators agree on that. W. Vine uses a different form of punctuation for this particular phrase, and essentially he has it say that if there is no resurrection of the dead, then they are dead people. I mean, that's kind of what his way of translating that is. It is true. I mean, that statement would be true. If there is no resurrection of the dead, then we are all dead people, dead spiritually. But again, I don't really think that fits into the context very well. And finally, some have suggested that this relates to a statement that Jesus had made to James and John. Remember the two sons of Zebedee who came to Jesus with their mother and asked for positions of preference in his kingdom, one to sit on his left hand, one on his right hand. And Jesus asked them the question, are you able to drink the cup which I will drink? And they both said, oh, yes, we're able. And Jesus said to them, essentially, you don't know what you're committing to, but he says, you will drink that cup. And of course, that cup that Jesus was speaking about was his death. And of course, we know that James was the first one of the apostles to die a martyr's death. So some have suggested that's what this means. Again, it really doesn't fit in the context. But these three, on the other hand, either because I think they're reasonable or because they're very popular, are the three I spend a little bit more time on. First one is just the most literal reading of the passage, at least the way it's translated in English. And that is, there are some who believe that in Corinth, there was this practice of people who would vicariously be baptized for a family member or friend, someone who had died and had not been baptized. And so there were some there who thought that they could be baptized on their behalf. This is one I don't believe is at all reasonable. It's simply not in keeping with anything the scriptures tell us about conversion. Baptism is for believers, that we are all judged by what we do in our body, not by what somebody does on our behalf after we're dead. There's just many, many things about this that just don't fit in with the scriptures. But if you take just this one verse by itself, that would be the most literal, natural understanding of it. The Mormons, I think, have that practice within their religion, the idea of this vicarious baptism for the dead. But I want to spend more time talking about these two. Who remembers what Joseph Arimathea is famous for? Say that again? Yes, he's the one who provided the tomb, but what did he do before he provided the tomb? Yeah, speak up. I'm not hearing. Yeah, he took care of the body of Jesus. And what is interesting about that is the scripture specifies that he had been a secret disciple of Jesus up until that point. And in fact, I think it's John's gospel tells us that Nicodemus was with Joseph. Why does he suddenly reveal his secret? What was it that just happened to cause him to reveal the fact that he had been a secret disciple of Jesus for some period of time? What did you just see? Well, he's preparing a tomb. He just saw Jesus die. He just saw his master, his Lord, die. And what does that inspire him to do? It inspires him to reveal his faith. That's not the only time we find something like that. In Acts chapter 8, when we read about the persecution that arose in the church from the oppression of Saul of Tarsus, what does it tell us happened with those disciples? Two things. One, it tells us that most of the disciples, except for the apostles, fled from Jerusalem. But what else did they do? They spread the word. The kingdom grew because of severe persecution. Paul tells us later that he was casting his vote to put Christians to death. So again, there's a situation where people were dying for the cause of Christ, and because of that, other disciples are growing in their faith. They're becoming more public about their faith. They're proclaiming the Lord that had died for them. I find that to be an interesting idea in light of what Paul is saying here. Otherwise, what would those do who are being baptized for the dead? Essentially, the idea there is because of the inspiration of the dead. Essentially, those who have been converted to Christ because of those who are martyrs. And then finally, and I really kind of want to just present these things for you to think about. We just don't have a lot of time to dig into it and try to come up with a group conclusion. But the last one is the idea that those who are dead is actually speaking of the person who's being baptized. Dead is not literal in the sense that they're physically dead, but dead is that they are spiritually dead. Essentially, they understand now, I'm dead in my sins. I've got to do something about that. My personal view, if you just force me, tell me which one you think, I think that's the most likely explanation of what this phrase means, particularly in light of the context. As I mentioned, Paul actually asked a bunch of other questions here, and I'm going to just kind of go through them quickly. Why are we in danger every hour? Now, was the apostle literally in danger every single hour? Interestingly, there's 1 hour I know he was not. And it was the hour he was on a ship that was going to be shipwrecked. But the reason I know he was not in danger is because the Lord had told him that every soul would reach the island safely, would reach the shore safely. So Paul knew then he was not in danger. So what does he mean when he says, why are we in danger every hour?
Well, in the larger sense, he was, I guess you could say, a wanted man by the Jews.
Yeah. Every hour is not to be taken literally here. I don't want to say hyperbole, but it is a situation where he's speaking in a general sense. There is a constant danger. The next one he said, why do I die daily? Did he die every day? Obviously not. He did die at some point, almost certainly for the cause of Christ. Jesus says in Luke chapter 9, he was talking to his disciples. I call it the midterm exam. And he's asking them, who do the crowd say that I am? And they gave various answers, John the Baptist, Elijah, the prophet. Who do you say that I am? That's where Peter had made the confession that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Then he told his disciples, what did they have to do to follow him? Take up their cross. And I mentioned Luke's gospel because Luke's the only one that adds this phrase, daily. Take up your cross daily and follow me. Well, what did it mean for a Jew to see someone walking down the street carrying a cross?
They carried an instrument of their own destruction.
Yeah, they're dying that day. So when Paul says, Why do I die daily to serve you? And then why am I taking up my cross every day? Again, it's not literal, not really hyperbole because it's very true. It's symbolic. And it finally says, what benefit did I gain from fighting wild beasts in Ephesus? I know there are some who believe that Paul at some point was thrown into the Colosseum and fought against lion or something, for the sport of the crowds. I really don't think that's what Paul was talking about here. I really think he's still using symbolic language. The fact is, there are many times where people are described as wild beasts. Evil people that were trying to do harm to God's people are described as wild beasts. So I think in this context, Paul is using a lot of symbolic language to just simply talk about the challenges, the dangers that are faced by Christians as they try to serve their Lord. And so this first question, what about those who are baptized on behalf of the dead? I don't think dead there should be understood as someone who has literally died physically and been buried in the ground. I think it is symbolic language also. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I hope that can at least give you something to think about. Mhm. Mhm. Right, and this is in the overall context of that resurrection of the dead that Paul has been talking about throughout all this. You bring up a good point. Paul has kind of flip-flopped back and forth talking about the physical life, spiritual life, physical death, spiritual death. And I think he does so intentionally. Let's look very quickly in John chapter 5. John chapter 5, if somebody could read verses 24 through 29. Chapter 5, verse 24 through 29.
Not been the judgment that has passed from death to life. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming, and is now here, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice. Come out. Those who have done good, the resurrection of life. Those who have done evil, the resurrection of death.
All right, we don't have time to dig into this real deep, but Jesus talks about two resurrections here. And yet he sort of mashes them together to show that they support each other, these two different resurrections. What's different is he says, both of them, he says, an hour is coming. And that just means that this is something that's been prophesied. But with the first one, he says, it now is. But then he says with the second one, he just says, an hour is coming. And I think the two resurrections here is exactly what we've been talking about. This idea of both the physical and the spiritual. I think in this first resurrection, Jesus is talking about the resurrection of those who hear his voice and respond in faith, have passed from death to life. They've passed from spiritual death to spiritual life. Very much what Jesus said to that thief on the cross with him. Today you will be with me in paradise. That man's sins were forgiven by Christ. He passed from death into life, even though he was still going to die physically. But then Jesus talks about another resurrection in which all will be raised. Interesting, he didn't say that about that first resurrection. But in this one, he says all will be raised. Some will be raised, as he said, to a resurrection of life, and some will be raised to a resurrection of destruction. Now, that ultimately, I think, has got to be talking about the final judgment. But Jesus here talks about these things, I don't want to say interchangeably, but definitely connected to one another. The spiritual resurrection that those have in him, and ultimately the resurrection that Paul is going to talk a lot about here as we get into our study, the latter part of chapter 15. The resurrection that ultimately is what his own resurrection points us towards. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Rick, because that I think really emphasizes that point. Anybody else with any thoughts or comments down through verse 32? Verse 33 is probably the second. Oh, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. For those who might not have been able to hear, David pointed out that when we talk about the Lord's Supper, we emphasize the death. But his question is, was Paul's question here about being baptized for the dead emphasizing only the death of Jesus and not recognizing the significance of the resurrection of Jesus? Is that, yeah. That's a very good, interesting question. There are two verses that parents use for their kids. My parents used it on me. I used it with my kids. Ephesians 6:1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. That was the very first verse I memorized. And the other one is this one, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33. Don't be deceived, bad company corrupts good morals. Did Paul suddenly decide to warn the teenage children of Corinth that they need to stay away from those parties that they shouldn't be a part of? Does that fit in the context of what he's been talking about? No, not at all. I'm not trying to ruin parents and their use of that verse. But that's not the particular context of what Paul is talking about. So what is he talking about? What has he been talking about? Specifically, what is he warning the church in Corinth about? Exactly. If that's what Paul is saying. The people who deny the resurrection, you need to realize what effect they have on you. That's what he's warning. They corrupt you. And the reason why is the next verse. 33 and 34 should always be studied together. I'm sorry, not the last part of verse 32. If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. This is an interesting quotation. It comes from Isaiah chapter 22, and I think this is important for us to look at the context of that quotation. Isaiah chapter 22. And it starts in verse 12. The overall context here is talking about the nation of Israel as they have drifted further and further away from God under the influence of Ahab and the kings that have followed after him. Verse 12, therefore in that day the Lord God of hosts called you to weeping and to wailing, to shaving the head, to wearing sackcloth. So what is God calling the people of Israel? What is he calling them to do? I believe it's the same thing we see with Habakkuk in the beginning of his letter. It's mourning. They're in sadness, they're in mourning, or at least God is calling them to be sad, to weep over the spiritual condition of Israel. And yet, what's the next verse tell us? Instead, there is gaiety and gladness, the killing of cattle and slaughtering of sheep, eating of meat and drinking of wine. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we may die. Instead of mourning the spiritual decay, what was the attitude of the people of Israel? Yeah, it's almost as if, well, things are just so bad, we may die tomorrow, so let's just enjoy ourselves today. That is what God is warning the church in Corinth. Someone who denies the resurrection, what is the logical conclusion of that teaching? Exactly. This life is all there is, so you might as well just get everything you can get out of it. And that's the corruption that Paul is so worried about with that church in Corinth, is the attitude of saying, what does it matter? When I die, I die. Might as well live life to its fullest. Have you ever heard any of these phrases I'm quoting? We hear them all the time. We see them in commercials all the time. We hear them in the entertainment that we do all the time. We hear them from our friends all the time. Paul is telling the church at Corinth, stop hearing that from your spiritual family. Don't be corrupted by that. Now we're going to see, as we get into it, what the opposite of that is. So verse 34, be sober-minded. Understand, sober-minded does not always mean that we're going to be sad and mopey face all the time. But what it does mean is that we are serious about serious things. That's what sober-minded means. The things that matter, they matter to us. We're serious about those things. And so he says at the end, you've got people there who have no knowledge of God, and you should be ashamed of that. That's something Paul's done a few times through the letter. He's saying, and sometimes, I don't want to shame you. But then there's been times where he said, in this, I want you to be ashamed. And this is one he wants to make very clear to them. People who do not understand the resurrection do not know God, and that is shameful that exists among you. Any thoughts or questions down through verse 34?
Do you think this speaks to one of the wider problems that we talked about in 1 Corinthians about this causing division within the church? Because people are discounting the resurrection to the point of just living for themselves, living for their own means, and being corrupted by that influence. That's just making that division worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
We're about to get to a section, I think, that really deals with, here's what you should do for others. Here's the way to correct this.
Right.
So I just wonder if this is not a tangent, but it kind of goes into the larger message of the letter.
I think so, absolutely. It's not just the resurrection itself is what's the most important thing, but what does the resurrection mean in my life? That's where it becomes the most important thing. It's not just, hey, I've studied this, so I've got a degree that says I understand the resurrection. You sometimes see that with people who go to universities. Sometimes they go to university not to develop a skill to live life, but they just go to learn. And Paul is, that goes back to what I said about verse 2. Believe, but believe to a purpose. And if it doesn't change the way you live your life, then you haven't believed to a purpose. Thank you. I appreciate it. Anybody else? All right. verse 34 through 35 through 49. There's no other way. This is exciting. For those of us who do believe in the resurrection, this is exciting to read what Paul says here. We don't know everything there is to know about the resurrection. I think John's the one who wrote that, it has not become evident exactly what we will become. God simply did not choose to give us a complete detailed picture of the resurrection. I think probably for what Paul says in 2 Corinthians, it's because we can't comprehend that. We just simply are too limited in this world to fully comprehend the beauty, the wisdom, the power, the glory of God. It's beyond our comprehension, words that are inexpressible. But what he does tell us about the resurrection is in itself glorious. That's a word that's used a lot of times here in this chapter. Now it came down to, we talked about those who denied the resurrection. I think part of the reason why they denied the resurrection is they didn't understand it. It didn't make sense to them. For example, what happened to James? I mentioned him earlier, the first martyr. How did he die? Does anybody remember? Yeah, he was beheaded. If we're resurrected, is he going to be carrying his head alongside with him? That's the concept. That's the kind of question that the disciples were. Well, you're saying he's going to be resurrected from the dead. There were two parts of him. They just did not understand, did not comprehend how this is going to happen. There were others. Paul talked about delivering their body to be burned. Are they going to be a pile of ashes walking around in heaven? Quite honestly, we all know what happens to the body when it's buried in the earth. It decomposes. How are they going to be resurrected? These were questions that people didn't know the answers to. And for some people, before they will believe in something, they have to know how it's going to work. And if they don't know how it's going to work, then they can't believe in it. Of course, that misses the whole point of the word faith, doesn't it? They weren't walking by faith. They were walking by sight. Tell me how it's going to work. Interestingly, Paul's reaction to this in verse 36 is kind of a strong term. He says, "You fool." That's not the same word that Jesus talked about in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, if anybody says to another one, "You fool," he is guilty of the high court, I believe was the term he used there. This is not the same word. This word literally means mindless. Someone's just not using their brain. But that's the point that Paul's trying to get across to them. That when they ask that kind of question, they're not reasoning. They're not thinking logically. Paul's been using a lot of logic in this chapter, and they're just not thinking logically. And so he uses an analogy that Jesus used a number of times, common things that people witness to illustrate something else. If you want to grow a corn stalk, well, corn's not a good idea. If you want to grow a wheat stalk, do you stick a whole wheat stalk in the ground to make another one come up? What do you put in the ground? A seed. Does the seed look like the stalk? Or I should say, does the stalk look like the seed? No, it's completely different. And it doesn't matter what you're talking about, whether you're talking about flowers, whether you're talking about coconuts, whatever it is you're talking about, what you put in the ground does not look like what comes up out of the ground. And they all knew that. And that's why Paul says, you're not understanding. The idea of a death, burial, and resurrection doesn't mean what's resurrected is exactly the same that was buried, that had died. In fact, he says God gives it a body as he chooses. He talks about different glory. There's glory of beasts, there's glory of man, there's glory of the sun, there's glory of the moon, there's glory of the stars, and each of the stars are different from one another. And who decides what that glory will be? Maybe the earliest lesson that children learn. God does. God decides that. And Paul's using it in this context, particularly to talk about that which is fleshly that is buried, and that which is spiritual that is resurrected. The spiritual is going to have a different glory than that which was buried. Those who are trying to think, well, this one was burned, this one was beheaded, this one, died of whatever. How are they going to be resurrected? They're going to be resurrected with the glory that God chooses to give them. That's the point that Paul is making. Now, he doesn't try to describe what we're going to look like, who we're going to know. These are all kinds of questions that people say, I can't wait to see you in heaven. We don't know what those things will be like. But what we do know is that which is physical that is buried will be changed into a spiritual glory. Go ahead, Brett. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. It doesn't emphasize the relationship that exists here on earth. And that's a good point. That let me just very quickly touch on this, and then we'll have to end. Paul emphasizes the difference between the earthly and the heavenly. He uses Adam and Jesus as the illustration of that. The first man, Adam, gave his nature to all of us. Jesus is the last Adam. And what is it he becomes? A life-giving spirit. So through Adam, we have physical existence. Through Jesus, we have spiritual existence, spiritual life. And so that's where we start thinking about the different glory. The glory of this world, which involves those relationships that Brett was talking about, or the glory of the world to come, where our relationship is with our Father. Anybody with thoughts or comments before we wrap it up? I appreciate your participation, and I hope I'm giving just a little bit of the excitement that I have as we study this, in helping you as we go through this.